By the time the wind stripped the last husk from the field, they had nothing left but jars, roots, and a hole in the ground. But that hole, dug by a man they once called a fool, kept 5 people alive through the blackest year the plains had ever seen. Before we step inside that cellar, tell us where you're watching from, and if old survival wisdom still matters today, subscribe for tomorrow's tale of grit and quiet genius. The others called him stubborn, the kind of man who'd plant a garden in the middle of a drought just to prove a point. But Albert Forley didn't plant to prove anything. He planted because it was the only thing he knew how to do. And when the sky stopped giving, he didn't look up for help, he looked down. In 1932, 2 years into the dry years, Albert began digging. Not a well, they'd tried that already. The water table had dropped too low, and the dust clogged every pipe. No, this was something different. He cleared a slope from the north side of the soded, the dest-kaleted, the barn, dug by hand through caliche and clay until the air turned cool and the light no longer reached the bottom. His wife Elsie thought maybe he was losing his mind. He didn't explain himself much. He just kept working a few feet every morning, a little more after supper. While other farmers tore down windbreaks for firewood or packed for California, Albert laid down cedar planks, built shelves against earth walls, and lined the ceiling with straw to catch condensation. His youngest daughter asked if they were building a mine. Albert smiled and said, "Something better." The neighbors had a nickname for everyone. One man was Fence Post Jim because he chewed wood when he ran out of tobacco. Another was Chimney Joe, who never built a house, just lived under the flue of a collapsed one. And Albert, well, they called him the Turnip King, because when all else failed, he could still get turnips to grow in soil others called dead. But Albert didn't trust what came from the earth anymore. It had betrayed them too many times. The rain skipped years like it had forgotten they existed. So he started storing. Not just food, but the memory of food, pickled beans from the last good year, dried corn wrapped in wax paper, jars of rhubarb jam so old the labels curled like dried leaves. When folks saw what he was doing, they laughed. "Ain't no root cellar big enough to feed a family when the whole country's starving," one said. Another told him you can't eat walls. But Albert just nodded. Quiet, patient, he wasn't storing food to show off. He was storing silence, peace, a way through the years that were still coming. By the end of that summer, his cellar was the coolest place for 50 miles, both in temperature and in temperament. Inside, it smelled like cedar and earth and vinegar. Outside, the wind had started changing color. It carried something darker than just dirt. And Albert, down there with his shelves and his jars, listened like a man waiting for a storm he'd already seen. It came in March of '33. Early, mean, and louder than anything the plains had heard before. Albert was hoeing the last row of dried-up onions when the sky dropped. It wasn't rain, it wasn't even dust, not at first. It was pressure thick and heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. By the time he reached the porch, the sun had vanished. The wind screamed like a wounded thing, and the field behind the barn blurred into nothing. Elsie stuffed wet rags in the window gaps. The children crouched in the corner, eyes wide, breathing through sleeves. It wasn't just the grit, it was the sound thunder without lightning, the roar of everything failing at once. And then came the dark. A full blackout in the middle of the afternoon. Albert lit the oil lantern and carried it into the cellar. It was the only place where the wind couldn't reach them, where breath came easier, where jars still gleamed like treasure. They didn't sleep that night. No one did. They just listened. The wind slammed against the house like a fist looking for a crack. By morning, the world was different. The chicken coop had vanished. The corn stubble was gone. Even the windmill blades had snapped clean off. Albert walked the property like a man taking inventory of what he'd lost, but really, he was looking for what remained, and what remained was the cellar, sealed tight, cool as ever. The shelves stood untouched. He began moving things underground that day. Sacks of potatoes, crates of carrots, anything still edible. The air above ground had turned hostile. It wasn't just weather anymore. It was siege. For the next 6 months, the cellar became their world. Meals were planned by what didn't spoil. A single onion could stretch across 3 dinners. Bread got thinner, but they always had something. And when the dust came again, and it always did, they'd carry the lantern down, close the hatch, and wait. Like moles. Like people waiting out the end of the world. Neighbors began showing up. First, to mock. Then to ask, one by one. Got any flour to spare? Know where a man can find dry salt? Albert helped when he could. Quietly. No sermons, no judgment. Just an extra jar here, a bundle there, but he always said the same thing. Winter's easy. It's April you need to fear. And when April came, and the last canned goods in other homes began to bulge and rot, the Forleys still had cool shelves, dry roots, and enough left to make it one more month. No one laughed anymore. They just watched the lantern glow in the cellar door, and wondered how a man they'd once called a fool had built the only place that still felt like tomorrow might come. By the fall of '33, the cellar wasn't just a storehouse, it was a rhythm. Each jar had its place, each shelf a memory. The kids learned how to turn the peaches to check for clouding, how to tap the potatoes, listen for rot. They learned the weight of a full jar versus one losing its seal. In that silence underground, they didn't just preserve food, they preserved skill, control. A flicker of self-respect when everything outside was turning to ash. Above ground, life frayed at the edges. The school shut down early that year. Too many families had pulled out, headed west with their wagons and their tin can trailers. Those who stayed looked half alive, coughing into kerchiefs, eyes raw from wind, skin crusted with grit. And still the storms came. Some short and sharp like a whip crack, others long, slow suffocations that turned daylight to midnight by noon. Albert made a ritual of descending to the cellar before each storm. He'd step inside, lantern held high, eyes sweeping the shelves. He moved like a priest checking the reliquary. It wasn't pride, it was inventory. Assurance, proof that something still obeyed order. That not everything had turned chaotic. They started keeping a chalk tally on the inside of the door, not of storms, of meals. Every time a jar was opened, a mark went up. It was a way of seeing time, of knowing how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. By November, the chalkboard held 157 white slashes. Elsie worried the shelves wouldn't last through winter. Albert just nodded and kept repacking the root bins, layering straw over the beets, checking moisture in the sand where the carrots slept. He wasn't worried about Christmas. He was worried about April. April was when everything went soft, when the jars started failing, when the cool earth warmed just enough to wake the mold. Still, they had food. Not much, not fresh, but food. On Christmas Eve, Elsie made biscuits from potato flour and tinned milk. She carved a tiny piece of preserved peach into 5 slices and placed one on each biscuit. No one spoke while eating. It felt like a ceremony. Come January, the neighbors returned, their faces thinner, their voices smaller. The Browns came first, 2 children, gaunt and coughing. Albert opened the hatch without a word. They sat together underground, passing a jar of green beans and a flask of vinegar like communion. Then the Wilkersons. Then the Thompson boy, barely 16, walking 10 miles with cracked boots for a sack of rice. Albert never turned them away, but he never gave without showing. He walked them through the slope of the entrance, the layers of straw above the rafters, the trick of tacking canvas behind the ventilation slit to keep the draft without the dust. Every gift came with a demonstration. Every jar handed over was a blueprint in disguise. And still he'd say, "Don't think winter's the worst. The worst is when the frost goes and the shelves start sweating." April was coming, and the chalkboard filled slowly with marks that meant they were still alive. The cellar had a sound to it, not the groan of earth settling or the wind above scratching at the boards. It was quieter than that. It was the breathing of people who still had something to hope for, even if it was just tomorrow's meal. One night, in late February, Albert heard something else. A knock, faint, slow. He opened the hatch to find a boy, maybe 10, standing alone in the dark. Dust coated his hair, his clothes, his lashes. He didn't speak. He just held out a folded scrap of paper. Written on it, in the trembling hand of a woman Albert barely knew, were 5 words. "He's all I have left." Albert led the boy inside without a word. made him sit on the cellar floor by the warm stove, and handed him a jar of pickled eggs. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The boy stayed, became part of the rhythm. Learned to pack root bins, stir the vinegar, count the breath between sealing wax boils. His name was Teddy, and by mid-March he was Albert's shadow. Quick with a knife, careful with the glass. The cellar didn't just store food anymore. It held people, their stories, their losses, their futures, if they were lucky. It was around that time the town began to change. Not officially, not with any meeting or decision, but slowly, quietly. Word spread of Albert's cellar, of his method, of the fact that he'd made it through 3 harvestless years without begging for bread lines or train tickets west. People started copying him. At first just digging pits, rough, shallow attempts with mismatched lumber and no ventilation. Some caved in, some rotted through. A few came to Albert asking for advice. He always obliged, patiently, kindly, but never softly. "This isn't storage," he'd say. "It's survival. You can't build it like a barn and expect it to last." He taught them to slope the entrance northward to avoid the southern heat, to bury shelves in the walls instead of building them out, to line the floor with sand and replace it every few months when it soured, and to never under any circumstance store glass near the ceiling where the temperature fluctuated. Teddy listened to it all like scripture. He started drawing diagrams, copying Albert's layout in a tattered notebook, said he was going to build his own one day. Albert just nodded. "Make yours better," he told him. By the time April rolled in, hot, brittle, unforgiving, nearly a dozen families had copied the design. Some made it work, some didn't. The difference wasn't always skill, it was belief. Belief that something buried in the ground could be a lifeline, that planning ahead mattered, even when the sky itself had turned against you. And every night, Albert still carried the lantern down, checked the jars, ran his hand over the wood like a father checking a sleeping child. The chalkboard read 237, and they were still here. The first spring rain came like a whisper, not enough to fill a tin cup, but just enough to smell. It hit the parched dirt and rose up in steam like a ghost exhaled from the past. Teddy ran out, barefoot, and stood in it, arms wide, mouth open, as if he could swallow back the sky one drop at a time. Albert didn't run. He stood at the cellar door, lantern in one hand, chalk in the other. The board inside read 284. He stared at it for a while before rubbing the chalk from the slate. No ceremony, just an ending. That spring brought more than rain. It brought a green haze to the edge of the fields, barely visible, but there. Seeds that hadn't sprouted in 3 years began pushing through. The wheat was thin, but it stood. The sun still burned too hot, and the wind still tasted like grit. But it was enough. Just enough to believe in again. One by one, the neighbors dug up their own cellars, some just holes, others half collapsed. They rebuilt, replanted. Those who had survived the worst began whispering a new name for Albert's place. The ground that gave back. It wasn't a nickname meant for mocking this time. It was reverence. Albert didn't talk about the storm, years much. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "We stayed busy." But others remembered. They remembered the jars, the hand-drawn diagrams, the nights packed shoulder to shoulder under a plank roof with a single lantern flickering like a prayer. They remembered how he'd stored enough not just for himself but for anyone who knocked. The boy, Teddy, never left. When Albert's back started giving out in '36, it was Teddy who lifted the crates, packed the bins, stirred the brine. He was taller now, stronger, but still quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from surviving something that tried to erase you. By 1940, most of the Dust Bowl had loosened its grip. Government programs planted shelter belts, taught contour farming, brought tractors and science and slogans. People pointed to that progress and said it saved the plains. Maybe it did. But in corners of the county, folks still said, "It started in that cellar." Albert passed in the spring of '42, buried under the same trees he'd planted as a windbreak back in '28. No headstone, just a cedar plank with his name and the word builder. Teddy carved it himself. The cellar still stands. Its roof patched with new lumber, its shelves lined now with different jars, peaches, beans, pickled eggs just like before. But there's a plaque on the inside of the door now, nailed there by the Historical Society, though Teddy never asked for it. It reads, "In this place, a man dug not to hide, but to endure. When the fields failed and the skies turned black, the ground gave back what he'd placed in it, not just food, but a future." And still, every spring, when the air smells like rain and memory, someone lights the lantern, walks the slope down into the earth, and says softly into the shelves, "We're still here."